Welcome Little Stranger presents The Most Wonderful Wonder.
Jump in for a joyride down history's back roads, past bizarre spectacles of tragedy, folklore, and strange true tales. Join your hosts, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, as we connect weird and wonderful pieces of the past and dig up the roots of American music.
Welcome to The Most Wonderful Wonder, a new and thrilling history and music podcast from Welcome Little Stranger. Every other week, we'll connect dark and strange fragments of history in unexpected ways and intersperse these unremembered stories with our own original folk noir compositions and covers of American roots music. From flooded mountain hollows and folk magic murder to patent medicine and Coney Island sideshow babies, the show will feature true and tragic tales, oddments of the past, and vanishing folkways. One of our favorite tragic tales is the grim and bizarre fate of Big Nose George.
No one knows exactly when George Parrott entered the world, but we know when he left it, and it is what happened after he escaped his earthly bonds that makes his biography so morbid as to be remarkable. Parrott was one of a gang of road agents and horse thieves who made their living relieving pay wagons and stagecoaches of their cargoes of cash in the Powder River country of Wyoming Territory. On August 16, 1878, the gang had plans to rob a Union Pacific train near Medicine Bow by tampering with the rails so that the train would derail. As they hid in the brush waiting for the train's arrival, a section crew, tasked with inspecting the rails on this isolated stretch of track, happened along and discovered the breach. As the railroad men worked to repair the tracks, a foreman rode ahead to stop the train and to inform the law that something suspicious was afoot. Their big score thwarted, the outlaws had no choice but to watch as the rails were repaired, and then when the work crew left, they rode away. Now the law was on to them, and a posse was sent to apprehend the would-be train robbers. A deputy sheriff named Robert Widowfield, along with Union Pacific detective Tip Vincent, soon tracked the outlaws to Rattlesnake Canyon, where the gang shot and killed the two lawmen. After the murders, the gang went their separate ways, and authorities offered a $10,000 reward for their capture, later doubled to $20,000. One of the gang, Dutch Charlie, was soon captured, but he never made it to trial. He was dragged from a train by an angry mob in Carbon and strung up from a telegraph pole. Another of the outlaws, Frank Toll, was killed within the month while trying to rob a stagecoach. But Big Nose George managed to escape to Montana and freedom. Arrested in Miles City, Montana, after another robbery, Big Nose's tongue was loosened with liquor, and he bragged about killing the lawmen in Wyoming. A telegraph was sent to the sheriff there, and in July of 1880, the outlaw was sent back by train to face trial in Rawlins. News of the capture reached Carbon before the train, and many of the same mob who had lynched Dutch Charlie overtook the train, pulling George off and stringing a rope around his neck. George Parrott pleaded for his life. He confessed to the murders and promised to tell law enforcement everything he knew if they would let him live. He must have made a convincing case because the crowd cut him down. When the trial came, he had second thoughts, first pleading not guilty, and then changing his plea to guilty once more. He was sentenced to die by hanging on April 2nd, 1881. But Big Nose George was not prepared to go quietly. In his cell at the Rawlins jail, he used a pocket knife and a piece of sandstone to file off the rivets of the heavy shackles on his ankles. Hiding in the water closet, he attacked jailer Robert Rankin with the shackles as he entered the area, fracturing his skull. Rankin called to his wife, Rosa, who managed to get George back into his cell by brandishing a pistol. News of the escape attempt spread fast, and at 10 o'clock that night, masked men with guns burst into the jail and dragged George from his cell. While a crowd of 200 looked on, Big Nose George was forced to stand on an empty kerosene barrel as a rope was tied around his neck and strung from a telegraph pole. The first time the barrel was kicked out from under him, the rope broke and he fell to the ground. A second attempt was botched, with George begging to be shot instead. Aided by gravity, the third hanging attempt finished the job, with the ill-fated outlaw struggling until his ears were torn off, as he slowly choked to death. As the undertaker placed the body into a coffin, it's said that George's considerable nose interfered with the lid, and excess pressure had to be exerted to close it and nail it down. This grisly detail was only a foreshadowing of the injustices Big Nose George would suffer in death. With no family to claim George Parrott's corpse, local doctors John Osborne and Thomas McGee, along with his 15-year-old assistant Lillian Heath, took possession of it. Acting within the medical ethics of the era, the physicians hoped that studying the outlaw's brain might give them scientific insight into his criminal behavior. The body's skull cap was crudely sawed off, but no significant differences between George's brain and a so-called normal one were found. Satisfied with the crude autopsy, Dr. McGee and young Heath left the corpse with Osborne. And here is where a slightly morbid story takes a turn for the gruesome. Dr. Osborne set about molding a plaster death mask of George's face. Next, he removed the skin from the dead man's thighs and chest, sending them to a Denver tannery with some very strange instructions. The tannery was to prepare the skin, including the outlaw's nipples, and make a pair of shoes and a doctor's bag. When Dr. Osborne received the shoes, he was disappointed to find that they didn't include the nipples, but he wore them with pride nevertheless. Osborne was not yet done with his dissection and experiments using George's body. So he kept the dismembered corpse in a whiskey barrel filled with a salt solution for the next year. When he was finished with his research, the barrel, still containing the remains of the outlaw, was buried in the yard behind Dr. McGee's office. Big-nosed George Parrott's story might have been lost to time, if not for the fact that the whiskey barrel containing his bones was unearthed by construction workers in 1950. Noticing the sawed-off skull, someone in the crowd of onlookers that had gathered to see the grisly discovery remembered that young Miss Lillian Heath had been given an outlaw's skull cap as a souvenir for her role as the doctor's assistant decades before. Heath, still living and by now in her 80s, had gone on to earn her own medical degree, becoming Wyoming's first female doctor. The skull cap, which was said to have served as both an ashtray and a doorstop in her office, was immediately brought to the site by Dr. Heath's husband, where it was found to be a perfect match. One might think that Dr. John Osborne, with his questionable medical ethics and disturbing taste in footwear, would have lived out the rest of his days in obscurity or even scorn. But history often writes more unbelievable endings than Hollywood. In 1893, Osborne is said to have worn the shoes made from George Parrott's skin to a ball held in his honor. The occasion for the gathering? John Osborne's inauguration as the third governor of the state of Wyoming.
The section man repaired the rails, and through our plans arrived. The lawmen chased us to the hills. We saw them come, we watched them die. They took me down the Robbins jail. I split his skull as I broke free. The lynching rope took 3 hard turns to make a specter out of me. The doctor stole my corpse away, and when the saw opened my head, he thought he'd find what turned me bad, a reason for the blood I'd shed. They took my skull, they took my skin, and sent it to the tannery. A whiskey barrel full of brine is what my cursed tomb will be. They flick their ashes in my skull, hearing not my phantom call. The bastard made shoes of my skin and wore them to
If you enjoyed this preview of The Most Wonderful Wonder, we hope that you'll subscribe to the podcast and be among the first to join us as we depart on our journey down the dirt roads of history on July 13th. To learn more about the podcast and us, Welcome Little Stranger, visit themostwonderfulwonder.com. While you're there, subscribe to our newsletter so you'll never miss a single electrifying episode.